In September 1943, Japanese pilots laughed when they first heard about America's new fighter, a machine so heavy it looked more like a bomber than a dogfighter. They called it a flying mistake. But within months, the laughter turned into horror, as this mistake became the single most destructive aircraft Japan would ever face, the F6F Hellcat. With a kill ratio of 19-1, it didn't just beat the Zero, it rewrote the entire future of aerial warfare. And before this video ends, you'll see why Japan's confidence crumbled overnight. If you love uncovering hidden truths about World War II, subscribe now. We've got more stories history tried to forget. In the steaming jungles of New Britain, at Rabaul Airfield on September 1, 1943, Japanese pilots stood at the height of their confidence. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, already a legend despite flying with only one eye after surviving a near-fatal encounter with American aircraft, skimmed through a new intelligence report. The document described America's latest fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. To the Japanese, who had spent 2 years dominating the skies with their Mitsubishi A6M0, this news was comedy. The report claimed the Hellcat weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero and was as large as a transport plane. It carried heavy armor, bulletproof glass, and enough fuel to fly farther than most thought possible. Sakai laughed openly, and those around him joined. To them, this was yet another example of America's flawed approach to war. Machines built heavy, wasteful, and clumsy. For 2 years, the math had been in Japan's favor. Over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the skies above Darwin, and across the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots had shredded Allied aircraft with kill ratios so lopsided they seemed impossible. Hurricanes, P-40 Warhawks, Brewster Buffaloes, all had fallen like dry leaves in autumn. The Zero was untouchable, a plane that had range, agility, and bite. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace of aces, once wrote that flying the Zero is like wearing wings. Compared to it, American aircraft felt like steel trucks lumbering through the air. So when the Hellcat arrived, loaded with armor and described as sluggish, Japanese pilots saw no threat. To them, it was simply another American failure waiting to be carved apart. But what they didn't know, what no one in that tent could have imagined, was that this so-called failure would bring about the annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. Within 6 months, those same men laughing at the intelligence report would be writing final letters home, knowing that meeting a Hellcat in combat meant almost certain death. The laughter of September 1943 was the calm before a storm that would forever alter the skies over the Pacific. To understand why the Hellcat's arrival was underestimated, you have to see the world as the Japanese saw it in 1943. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had enjoyed victories that bordered on the mythical. At Pearl Harbor, they lost just 29 aircraft while destroying 347. Over the Philippines, their ratio was 7 losses against more than 100 American planes destroyed. In the skies over Australia, they decimated Allied defenses with near impunity. The Zero was at the center of all of it, sleek, light, and engineered with a philosophy that prized agility above all else. The Zero's miraculous performance was no accident. It was constructed from a secret alloy called extra super duralumin, which shaved off crucial weight. Designers stripped everything unnecessary. No armor to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent explosions, sometimes not even radios to save 30 pounds. Every ounce sacrificed meant tighter turns, longer range, and faster climbs. For pilots trained under Bushido, the samurai code that prized skill and sacrifice, this philosophy made perfect sense. Survival was not as important as performance. The plane was a sword, and the pilot its wielder. So when the first specifications of the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence through neutral Sweden in early 1943, they dismissed it outright. At 12,000 pounds fully loaded, it weighed more than double the Zero. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine looked like an anchor, not an advantage. To men like Captain Minoru Genda, the strategist behind Pearl Harbor, the math was obvious. In a turning fight, the heart of Japanese air tactics, the Hellcat was helpless. The Zero's wing loading guaranteed it could turn inside almost anything, while the Hellcat's bulk suggested it would flounder. But this was Japan's fatal miscalculation. What they couldn't see from their narrow perspective was that America was no longer designing aircraft to play by Japan's rules. The Hellcat didn't need to outturn a Zero. It was built for an entirely different game, one that emphasized speed, power, and survivability over elegance. It was designed to absorb punishment, strike with overwhelming force, and climb into positions the Zero could never follow. By focusing so narrowly on dogfighting mathematics, the Japanese missed the bigger picture. They were about to face not just a plane, but an entirely new philosophy of war. The illusion of invincibility finally cracked on September 30th, 1943. Over Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui escorted a reconnaissance plane when he spotted 6 unfamiliar shapes climbing from the southeast. At first glance, he thought they were medium bombers. Their size seemed too great for single-engine fighters. But as the formation turned, he saw them clearly. Broad fuselages, short wings, and that massive blunt nose housing the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. The Hellcats had arrived. Fukui reacted with the instinct drilled into every Japanese pilot. Turn hard, exploit the Zero's agility, and slide onto the enemy's tail. For 2 years, this maneuver had been a death sentence for Allied fighters. But the Hellcat didn't take the bait. Instead of trying to match the Zero's turn, the American fighter went vertical. Its 2,000 horsepower engine roared, hauling the heavy airframe skyward at a climb rate no Japanese plane could match. Fukui tried to follow, but his Zero's airspeed bled away, the fragile engine gasping as gravity pulled at its light frame. Then came the maneuver that stunned him, a hammerhead stall turn. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat pivoted, nose dropping with precision, bringing its 650 caliber machine guns directly onto Fukui's tail. The volume of fire was staggering. 17 rounds ripped through his aircraft in 3 seconds. Only by throwing his Zero into a desperate spin did he escape, limping back to Marcus Island with holes riddled across his wings and fuselage. His wingman never returned. This was no accident, no lucky encounter. The Hellcat was not fighting the Zero's fight. It was rewriting the rules. Instead of agility, it relied on raw energy, climbing, diving, striking with overwhelming firepower, and refusing to turn battles into drawn-out duels. For Fukui, it was a glimpse of a terrifying new reality. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end. The Hellcat had drawn first blood, and it had done so by ignoring everything Japanese pilots believed about how air combat was supposed to work. Just 5 days later, the skies over Wake Island provided the next brutal lesson. On October 5, 1943, Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led a squadron of 12 Zeros to intercept what he assumed was a routine American nuisance raid. For months, U.S. carriers had launched hit-and-run strikes, withdrawing before Japanese pilots could fully engage. Shiga intended to punish them this time, with altitude, surprise, and position, his men dove on 12 Hellcats cruising below. Victory seemed certain, but the Americans didn't scatter. They didn't panic or break formation. They held their line, diving gently to keep speed, soaking up the incoming fire. When the Zeros swooped in for their killing pass, they found that the Hellcats weren't fragile like Wildcats or P-40S. Armor plating shielded the pilots. Self-sealing fuel tanks shrugged off incendiary rounds. Bullets sparked and glanced away as if the planes themselves were refusing to die. Then came the counterattack. Using their weight as a weapon, the Hellcats clawed for altitude and then dove like predators. Each dive turned speed into killing power. 6 Browning .50 caliber guns unleashed torrents of fire that ripped through Zeros in seconds. Shiga's men tried to engage in the only way they knew: tight turns, fluid maneuvers, the elegant dance of dogfighting. But the Hellcats refused the duel. They struck and climbed, struck and climbed, each pass leaving more Zeros in flames. By the end of the battle, 8 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Not a single Hellcat was lost. For the men who survived, it was a nightmare. Their best tactics had failed. The Zeros' once unmatched agility was now meaningless against the brutal efficiency of American energy fighting. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanamizu would later brief his men with chilling honesty. "Forget everything you know about air combat. The Americans no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners." The myth of Japanese air superiority, built carefully since 1941, was crumbling. The Hellcat was no longer a rumor, no longer a punchline. It was a machine of industrial war, and Wake Island had shown that the Zero, once the hunter, was now the prey. By late 1943, cracks in Japan's aerial dominance widened into gaping chasms. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the very man who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, was now tasked with inspecting damaged aircraft at Truck Lagoon. What he found disturbed him. Zeros returning from combat with Hellcats weren't just outmaneuvered. They were being torn apart by raw firepower. The math told the story. Each Hellcat carried 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each capable of spitting out 750 rounds per minute. That meant over 4,500 bullets per minute, each with nearly 5 times the impact energy of the Zero's lighter 7.7mm rounds. In a single 3-second burst, a Hellcat could unleash more destruction than an entire flight of Zeros firing simultaneously. And unlike Japanese fighters, the Hellcat had the ammunition reserves to sustain prolonged combat. 2,400 rounds in total. Armor compounded the imbalance. The Zero had sacrificed every ounce of protection to achieve its agility. But the Hellcat was built for survival. Over 200 pounds of steel plate shielded the pilot. Another 100 pounds surrounded its vital oil system. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, able to take multiple hits without igniting. A Zero struck once in the wrong place became a funeral pyre. A Hellcat could limp home with wings shredded and fuselage riddled, its pilot still alive. But the true terror for Japanese aviators came not from armor or guns, but from something they could not see: radar. American carriers directed their Hellcats with precision unseen in aviation history. While Japanese pilots scoured the skies with strained eyes, U.S. controllers, sitting safely on ships, were tracking enemy formations from over 50 miles away. Hellcats no longer hunted. They were guided to their prey. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described the horror in his diary. "They knew where we were, our altitude, our heading. We were blind men fighting ghosts. This wasn't just a technological edge. It was a complete rewriting of air combat. The Hellcat wasn't an airplane in isolation. It was the tip of a spear forged by radar, radios, and industrial might. For Japan, the skies were becoming an execution ground, where every advantage it once held was being systematically erased. If American technology was one blade of the guillotine, Japan's crumbling pilot corps was the other. Before the war, Imperial Navy aviators were the elite of the elite. Training spanned 3 grueling years, with candidates logging 700 hours in the cockpit before ever seeing combat. Those who graduated were masters of their machines, the equivalent of samurai in the sky. It was this skill, paired with the Zero's performance, that carved such brutal kill ratios in the war's opening years. But war devoured experience faster than Japan could replace it. By 1943, the pipeline had collapsed under the weight of attrition. Fuel shortages forced training flights to be cut drastically. Ammunition was so scarce that cadets were limited to firing as few as 50 practice rounds before being deployed. Advanced lessons in formation flying, instrument navigation, and night combat were abandoned entirely. Desperate to fill cockpits, Japan began pushing pilots to the front lines with barely 200 hours of total flight time. Meanwhile, America's training machine ran at full throttle. Pilots arrived in the Pacific with at least 300 hours under their belts, including dozens in the Hellcat itself. They had practiced carrier landings until they were second nature. They had drilled slashing boom and zoom tactics over the safe fields of Texas, and they had fired thousands of rounds in training. When they entered combat, they weren't raw. They were polished predators. The disparity was staggering. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a Japanese training officer, put it bluntly in his report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." He recounted the case of a pilot named Ensign Yamamoto, who had never fired his guns in flight because there was no ammunition for training. On his first mission, Yamamoto was shot down in 7 minutes. This was the new reality. America's system was producing pilots faster, stronger, and better prepared, while Japan's vaunted elite was being replaced by boys who barely knew how to fly. And against the Hellcat, an aircraft designed to turn skill gaps into slaughter, the results were catastrophic. By the fall of 1944, Japan's pilots were no longer fighting battles. They were being fed into a machine that turned combat into extermination. This brutal truth came into sharp focus during the Battle of Formosa, fought between October 12th and 16th, 1944. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the Japanese Second Air Fleet, threw every remaining resource into the skies. Over 700 planes, including the last of Japan's seasoned veterans, were launched to stop the American carrier onslaught. At first, reports from returning pilots painted a picture of triumph. Radio operators claimed 26 American carriers and battleships had been sunk, with hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed. The propaganda was intoxicating, a vision of Japan's glory reborn. But when the gun camera footage was reviewed, the truth was chilling. American losses amounted to only 89 aircraft. Japan, on the other hand, had lost 329 planes and nearly every surviving veteran who could still guide the next generation. For those who lived through it, the skies over Formosa resembled something closer to ritual slaughter. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu later wrote, "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. Above us, below us, behind us. We climbed. They were already higher. We dove. They were already lower. They had divided the sky into a net. It was not combat. It was extermination." The reasons were simple, but devastating. The Hellcat's kill zone extended far beyond the Zero's limits. Its engine produced raw speed at altitudes where Japanese fighters gasped for air. Its radios meant formations moved like one organism, each pilot covering the others. And guided by radar, these blue giants intercepted Japanese squadrons with such precision that pilots often never saw the ambush until tracers stitched across their wings. What Japan faced at Formosa wasn't an enemy squadron. It was a system, a network of radar, doctrine, technology, and training that turned air combat from a duel of skill into a science of inevitability. By the time the smoke cleared, Japan's air arm was no longer an offensive force. It was a corpse still walking, and the Hellcat had been the executioner. If Formosa was the death knell, then the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was the funeral pyre. Known forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, it was the day Japan's air power was shattered beyond recovery. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa brought 9 carriers and 450 aircraft to the decisive battle. His goal: to crush the American carriers and reassert control of the Pacific. Facing him was Task Force 58, 15 carriers, and nearly 1,000 aircraft, half of them Hellcats. On paper, the Japanese still had numbers. In reality, they were feeding fledgling pilots into the grinder. Radar picked up the first wave of Japanese attackers at a distance of 150 miles. American fighter directors calmly vectored divisions of Hellcats into perfect intercept positions. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, described the moment. "They came at us in neat formations, and we hit them like hammers. They tried to turn with us. We refused. We struck, climbed, and struck again. They stalled, and we picked them off one by one." In just 12 minutes, 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft in the opening wave were gone, and the slaughter continued all day. By nightfall, 346 Japanese carrier planes had been destroyed, 3/4 of Ozawa's entire force. American losses? Barely 30 aircraft. The disparity was so grotesque that U.S. pilots mocked the massacre as turkey hunting. To the Japanese, however, there was nothing humorous about it. The destruction of so many carriers and pilots in a single day erased decades of investment in aviation. Surviving veterans spoke of Hellcat formations as steel curtains that blotted out the sky. The few who returned to their carriers did so, knowing they had witnessed the end of Japan's air arm. After the battle, Japanese naval officers stopped speaking of air combat as warfare. They spoke of it as slaughter, mechanized and inescapable. From that day on, Japan's air strategy shifted from conventional defense to kamikaze desperation. The Hellcat hadn't just won a battle. It had obliterated the very possibility of Japanese victory in the Pacific skies. By late 1944, the Hellcat had transformed air combat into a one-sided equation. For Japan, the arithmetic was brutal. Every zero lost meant a pilot gone forever, replaced by a recruit with half the training, half the skill, and none of the hope. For America, every Hellcat loss was a temporary setback, instantly replaced by a new machine rolling off Grumman's assembly line every hour. This imbalance would define the war's final year. The clearest sign of desperation came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where Japan's air forces attempted one last decisive strike. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, led just 7 Hellcats against a force of 60 incoming Japanese planes. In the span of 90 minutes, McCampbell personally shot down 9 aircraft. His wingman, another 6. 15 Japanese planes fell without a single American loss. What had once been a contest of warriors was now an execution carried out by a machine perfectly designed for the task. Unable to fight conventionally, Japan turned to the kamikaze. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi admitted the grim calculation. If a Zero attacks a carrier, its chance of success is near zero. If it becomes a bomb, its chance rises to 30%. The kamikaze was less about bravery than mathematics, a horrifying attempt to rewrite the equation the Hellcat had made impossible. Yet even then, Hellcats proved to be the fleet's shield. At Okinawa in 1945, they intercepted nearly 80% of kamikaze sorties before they could reach their targets, their 6.50 caliber guns shredding desperate pilots who never had a chance. When Japan surrendered, the numbers told the story. The F6F Hellcat had achieved a kill ratio of 19-1, destroying over 5,200 enemy aircraft for just 270 lost in combat. Japanese pilots who had once laughed at the Hellcat's weight and bulk were either dead or flying suicide missions. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, offered the final verdict. The Zero was a great fighter. The Hellcat was a great weapon system. We never understood the difference until it was too late. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated the Zero. It had destroyed the very philosophy of air combat Japan had built its empire upon. Where the Zero embodied individual skill, the Hellcat embodied an entire system: industrial power, radar guidance, energy fighting doctrine, and overwhelming firepower. In the end, it wasn't the most graceful fighter that ruled the skies. It was the one backed by a nation capable of mass-producing victory. The Hellcat had the last laugh. And it was a laugh echoed across the Pacific every time a blue-winged Grumman roared off a carrier deck, carrying with it the certainty that Japan's reign in the skies was already over.